So welcome to the first panel on AI and free speech. As Manela said, my name is Angele Christin. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication here, and I'm an ethnographer. I study the role of algorithms in practice, as I call them, in the case of criminal justice and online news. And I am thrilled to have such distinguished panelists here today to discuss AI and free speech. So let me start on my right. So Dunstan Allison-Hope comes from BSR, so Business for Social Responsibility, where he oversees the questions of human rights, women's empowerment, and inclusive economy practices. Dr. Jeremy Gillula, here on the right, has a PhD, is from the Electronic Frontier Foundation and has a PhD in computer science from Stanford. On my left, Katie Joseff is from the Institute from the Future, right, where you work in the Digital Intelligence Lab with Sam Woolley, so very happy to have you here today. And Andy O'Connell serves as Facebook's head of content distribution and algorithm policy. And so basically, the question of AI and free speech is very much a broad one. And so today, in kind of having this panel together, we're going to try to have an inclusive discussion of the roles that artificial intelligence, broadly defined, can play in questions of bots, moderation on social media, reconfiguration of speech in the public sphere, filter bubbles, echo chambers, and I hope other questions. And so where we'll organize the discussion is each panelist will start by giving a 5-minute introduction. Then we'll moderate the discussion, and finally we'll open it up for questions from the audience for the last 20 minutes. And so perhaps, if that's okay, Dunstan, you could start.
Great, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I should say my degree is in history, so thank you, Alexa, for making me feel welcome here and making a good contribution. So I have 3 points I want to make, and they're reasonably high level, so hopefully it can set the scene for the discussion. And these are 3 key messages that we're taking to our member companies as it relates to artificial intelligence and human rights. And the first point is essentially to agree with the opening keynote, which is that human rights-based methodologies offer a robust framework. Oh, I have slides. There we go. Human rights methodologies offer a robust framework for the responsible development and use of AI and should form an essential part of business policy and practice. And as was mentioned, we have lots of different ethical frameworks being established for artificial intelligence. You hear lots of discussion around ethics and AI. We've been advocating for over a year now the importance of a human rights-based approach. The ethics alone are not sufficient. So I was thinking about this panel on freedom of expression and why that point is important in this context. And it's really about the interdependency of different human rights. If you think about how we're going to realize the right to freedom of expression, there are other rights in play: freedom of association, freedom of movement, child rights, privacy. It takes a disciplined look across all human rights to really be able to address the full range of human rights that are relevant, but also really to get into how to properly respect and protect the right to freedom of expression. So this is one key message that we're taking to our member companies, and very much agree with the opening comments there. The second, which is up there, companies outside the technology industry have an essential role to play and should be much more proactively involved in the development of responsible approaches to AI. So it's very interesting that there's this tremendous flourishing of discussion around ethics, human rights, and AI. Lots of new initiatives, lots of dialogue. Most of the companies participating in them are from the technology industry, and that's great. There's good reason for that to be happening. We note the absence of companies from other industries. And again, if you think about how you realize the right to freedom of expression, it does rely on lots of other rights like privacy, like freedom of movement, freedom of association. And so think about how artificial intelligence, facial recognition will be deployed in the transportation industry, in retail, in hotels, in banking. Think about how artificial intelligence is going to be used in other industries. And what we're saying to our member companies is it's not just the technology sector that needs to be at the table in these discussions. It's something for every industry to be actively engaged in. The third point I'm afraid of making, because I really want to sort of delegate this point to Katie, I think, ultimately. But we need innovative methods of human rights due diligence to uncover blind spots, imagine unintended consequences, and anticipate a highly uncertain future. We work with member companies to undertake human rights due diligence, identify human rights impacts, risks, opportunities, things that are going to happen in the future. And what do we know about AI? The future is very uncertain. And we have a fear that undertaking human rights due diligence, as it is often done today, is too narrow and is not imaginative enough. And we need to deploy new methods of strategic foresight, brainstorming, imagining crazy futures that is going to enable us to uncover blind spots and think through risks to freedom of expression that we might not otherwise imagine. We worry that we come into conversations about human rights and business with too much of a narrow frame of mind, and we need to use methods that broadens our horizons and helps us think through some of sort of crazy, unthinkable, unintended futures that actually might become real before we know it. So those are the 3 points we're taking to our member companies. And Katie, I hope I didn't steal your...
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So my name is Jeremy Gillula. I am a Stanford graduate. It's great to be back. I work at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a digital civil liberties organization. We've been around for about 25 years. And like Dunstan, I also have 3 major points I want to cover, and they're actually in 3 very different directions. The first is that this is not a theoretical problem. We already have bots censoring speech in the sense of an automatic system that takes down people's content. And these are programs used by companies like Facebook and Google. They were originally designed to police copyright. But bots are not very good at determining what content should stay up and what content should stay down. Last year, a guy posted 10 hours of static, and it was subject to 5 automatic copyright notices. So a bot decided 10 hours of static had 5 different copyrights on it, and basically said, you can't post this. Just earlier this year, there was a guy doing a mic check. Literally, he had bought a new mic, I guess, for his video blog. And that also, same thing, an algorithm decided there's a copyright on this guy doing a mic check. And he was not, singing a song or anything even close to that. He was just talking into the mic. So to the extent that bots and AI threaten our speech, they're already doing so, and they're doing it terribly. The second direction I want to talk about is how AI interacts with mass surveillance. One of EFF's sort of centerpiece, we're not only a technology organization, but there are a bunch of lawyers at EFF. We do a bunch of lawsuits. One of our centerpiece lawsuits is against the NSA for doing mass surveillance, basically sucking up everyone in the US's internet traffic and then looking at it to say, are you doing anything suspicious? Or are there any keywords here that we should be looking at? And the really scary thing about AI is that it takes what used to be, an analyst would have to think about, like what keyword do I want to look at, and it allows an AI to do that analysis much faster at much larger scale, and it not only allows a nation like the US to do this sort of thing, it makes it a lot easier for nations with maybe not the same budget to fund, a billion-dollar organization like the NSA to be able to do this analysis. And to me, that's really scary because when people know that their communications might be searched and then might be analyzed, and then something they say might be detected by an AI and used to, call them in to a local police department, they're going to start censoring themselves. And so, as Dunstan said, free speech implicates other things. It implicates privacy, it implicates security. The last again, this is yet in another orthogonal direction. I want to talk a little bit about social media bots. So we're all familiar with the allegations that social media bots influenced the last US presidential election. And in the wake of that, we've seen a lot of politicians sort of point at these social media bots and say, this is the new boogeyman, we need to do something about this. I don't care what we do, we need to do something about this. And sadly, doing something usually has all sorts of unintended consequences. We saw a proposed bill last year in California, a state bill, that would have required bots to, not only for you to identify if your social media account is a bot, but because this was written by a politician, it would have applied to your email account too. So if you had used a vacation autoresponder, you would have needed to identify your email account as being a bot. It gave people, it would have required social media companies to allow people to report bots, which sounds like a great idea until you think that a lot of white supremacist groups, homophobic groups, groups like this are already using reporting systems in social media networks to take down the accounts of people they don't like. They know how to work these systems, and so they will be able to figure out, like, oh, I know what makes an account look like a bot, so then I will watch and I will even maybe provoke you into saying the things that make it look like you're a bot, and then I'll report you and I'll get you taken down because I don't like your speech, even though you're a real person. So I guess what I'm getting at is there is no, as far as I can tell, workable ID proposal for a law that would require people to identify bots on social media that wouldn't have disastrous unintended consequences. Instead, I think the right approach here is, instead of either censoring or saying, we're going to allow people, we must identify bots, we should be giving users more control of what is in their feed. Instead of trying to censor content like nudity or supposed hate speech, we should give users the option to say, and maybe maybe this is sensible defaults, but then they can check them or toggle them off, that say, this is the sort of information I'm okay with seeing, this is the sort of information I'm not. Of course, this would sort of go against the bottom lines of these major companies, because what they want to maximize is your attention on these platforms. And once you start to have control over your feed, you get to have control over how much attention you devote. And so far we've encountered a great deal of resistance from companies when we try to tell them, you need to give users more control. But I think that is one of the major solutions to dealing with sort of the implications of AI and freedom of expression.
Yes, getting picked.
Yeah, you win.
You're trying to move out of the way. Yeah, so actually I'm going to discuss a little bit about social bots and how because it is a controversial impact that they have on public opinion and shaping public opinion. Because looking at 2016, many researchers found that bots did have an influence on the conversation that surrounded the US candidates online. But we just conducted a study on 2018 on how different social groups and issue publics, such as Latinos, Muslim Americans, environmentalists, were impacted by disinformation and harassment. And we found that for anti-Semitic content, only 18% of the accounts sharing anti-Semitic content were bots. And as far as moderate Republicans, we looked at the conversation around the Arizona primary and John McCain's funeral, and around only 9% of the content was from bots. And comparing human users and bot users with regard to Arizona, they are both sharing equal amounts of disinformation, though the bot accounts were sharing some more anti-Semitic content and were sharing some sites that were used by spammers that are more marketing sites. So there's this question of, if there's all this hate speech in this unsafe public sphere online, how much of it is the automated accounts? And this may also have to do with Twitter doing a better job of removing bots, and how much of it is bad users who are exploiting the environment and using that to make other users unsafe, or to shift public opinion as human users, which is more difficult to regulate. So this brings me to the question of, but bots are still being used by governments to manipulate public opinion. Just a few days ago, Twitter removed 5,000 tweets that were pushing this hashtag Russiagate, and they were trying to discredit the Mueller report. And the tweets only had a few tweets prior, and they're all pro-Saudi tweets, but attribution is very hard to prove. So bots are continually being used by governments and bad actors, but how much is their impact in compared to human users? As Dr. Cohen mentioned, there's very important with design, because if it's all about human users actually exploiting the platform, how can we make the platform designed in a way that makes it so collective intelligence actually leads to good decision making and high quality information sharing? So a few of those factors that could improve the platform and the way people discuss are, changing the ways in which people present themselves online. So there was one study of collective intelligence that found if people were talking to people of other political parties but didn't have party logos or any signals of partisanship, they ended up discussing and reaching to a better conclusion of what a factual outcome was with regard to climate change. And there's also the issue of, being able to, sort and curate your own timeline so the algorithm is not directly impacting what your experience is with the information, as there's been a concern with YouTube and extremist content and people not being able to pick kind of the direction which they're being pushed with the algorithms and the content they're experiencing. So, yeah, and I was also going to say, sorry, it's a bit early, but that bots, of course, are not all bad, and many bots are being used for journalistic purposes, such as crawling large data sets to help, find issues in the law or changes. There was a Twitter account called Congress Edits that looked at every time congressional IPs changed Wikipedia entries. And so that was a look at more transparency. But then actually in the fall of 2018, during the Kavanaugh hearings, it was used by a bad actor to dox senators. So a bad actor who ended up being arrested edited the Wikipedia entries of different senators with their private information so that then people could go and target and harass them. And so I think this points to this issue that there are bots, but they're mostly a tool of bad human actors to manipulate public opinion. So the broader question is, how can we create spaces where bad actors aren't allowed outsized influence, and we can allow, collective intelligence, as was originally dreamed for the internet and the Wikipedia model, to triumph.
Great. So maybe I'll start by sort of associating myself with Alexa and Dunstan's remarks about the importance of human rights and the human rights framework informing our values. So at Facebook, we are focused on values like safety, voice, equity, privacy. And those are sort of the substantive values which are informed by human rights law. I want to actually focus my remarks on sort of procedural values and how we try to operate in this space. And like some of my colleagues, I'll make 3 points. So I think we're trying to operate increasingly in an accountable way. And I think about accountability in terms of transparency, consultation, and oversight. That might be my phone. No, it's not. Okay. So on transparency, we've done a lot and we need to do a lot more. And I think that some of the things that we've done lately that we think are particularly important is we have
I think it may be my phone.
Oh,
and now I am
sorry.
I am blushing. This is artificial intelligence. It's
Yeah.
not me, it's
It's a bot calling her. So transparency, consultation, and oversight. On transparency, and I'll focus my remarks around content and content moderation and content ranking, because that's what my team is primarily focused on. So for content moderation and ranking, we've done a lot of things lately. About a year ago, we published for the first time our internal community standards, the guidelines that reviewers use for making decisions about what is and isn't allowed on Facebook. That was a big move that we made about a year ago. We also updated our transparency report, which we've published since I think about 2013. But it was traditionally focused on our interaction with governments and government requests for user data and government censorship requests. And we added what we call the Community Standards Enforcement Report, which provides a lot of detail about the kinds of content that we take down and the reasons that we take it down. And so in that report, you can see, for example, we took down 2.9 million pieces of hate speech in Q3. That number might not be right, but you can just Google it and you'll see the number. We also say things like the proactivity rate, so the rate at which artificial intelligence is helping accelerate and inform those decisions. So I believe the latest number on hate speech is 52% of hate speech that we remove is proactively identified, which means prior to a Facebook user reporting it to us. So that's in our transparency report. Also in the transparency bucket, we've been trying to get a lot better at explaining how ranking works. So we have a blog called Inside Feed, which explains how newsfeed ranking works, and we've committed that anytime we're going to make we make a significant change to how newsfeed ranking works, we're going to publish a blog post that explains what we're doing, why, what we expect the implications to be. We've also, only about a month ago now, launched a product called Why Am I Seeing This? And so now you can go to any post in your Facebook newsfeed and click on the little sort of two-sided triangle up in the top right corner and select why am I seeing this post, and we'll explain to you why that particular post is where it is in your feed. And the kind of information you'll get is you're seeing this post because you chose to follow this person or you chose to follow this page, but also you disproportionately interact with posts from this person, or you disproportionately interact with photos as opposed to videos. And then right there in that tool, you can actually see examples of you recently doing the behavior that is driving that ranking decision. So all of that is in this transparency bucket. We're trying to go much farther, and we're trying to get better at explaining specific actions that we take regarding your content if you're the publisher of content. So for example, there's now a surface called the page quality tab, where you can go and see any time you've violated any of the Facebook community standards and why, and you can actually appeal them right there. But also, if we, for example, have classified you as a misinformation repeat offender and are therefore systematically demoting your content going forward, you can see that in this new surface. And that surface is going to be a place where we're going to add more and more types of signals to give you more and more transparency and also allow you to appeal more and more actions that we're taking. So in the consultation bucket 2, there's also a lot of work that's going on, and I'll just sort of divide it into sort of policy consultation and product consultation. Every 2 weeks, Tuesday mornings, we have the Content Standards Forum, which is the internal sort of legislative session at Facebook where we make decisions about changes to our community standards or our advertising policies or misinformation policies. And those meetings, we now, not only do we publish the minutes of those meetings so anybody can sort of see what's going on and why, but we also, prior to those meetings, any of the options that are being teed up for debate have been subject to extensive external consultation. And so we will preview the options with stakeholders, experts in whatever the sort of domain is, all around the world, get their feedback, and bring that feedback back into the meeting before we make a decision about a significant policy change. On the product side, similarly, we've committed to consulting with external stakeholders with domain expertise before making significant product changes. Notably, on April 10th, we announced that we're going to invest in exploring ideas to tackle misinformation that rely more on direct community input about the quality of content, and that we're going to do a multi-month process to consult with stakeholders around the world to make sure that any products that we're developing are consistent with sort of the product goals, but also our human rights commitments. So that's sort of the consultation bucket. And then finally, on the oversight bucket, we have sort of internal business processes that provide oversight. So any significant product that's being launched has to go through a standard product review process, which includes, human rights checkpoint, privacy checkpoints, publisher impact checkpoints, legal checkpoints, et cetera. That's all sort of just bread and butter. But we're also trying to experiment with doing more aggressive oversight things. So the example that's gotten the most attention is we're trying to build an oversight board to which users can directly appeal content removal decisions. So if we've taken your post down or your page down and you don't think it's right, you can appeal to us already, but we're trying to build an external body, an independent body that you can seek additional recourse from, and we hope to have that live by the end of the year. We're also working with governments on smart regulation approaches and codes of conduct to provide an additional layer of accountability and oversight. And finally, we are already subject to a number of sort of auditing mechanisms, both internally and independently, to include the Global Network Initiative, does a biannual assessment of our compliance with our human rights commitments under the Global Network Initiative. We have privacy audits that we're subject to, and I would expect you'll see more and more of those. So the last thing I guess I'll say is, because I imagine some of you are thinking, what on earth is this guy talking about? If all of that is true, why are there all these problems? I do want to just lay out there that much of what I've discussed is new in the last 3-4 years. And so we're building all this stuff out, and we have a lot more work to do. We think we've done a good job. We think we're industry leading in almost all of this, but there's a lot more work that we're going to do, and so I'm excited to be here. So thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation of what's going on at Facebook. I think that this is very valuable for everybody on the panel and in the room. And so I actually would like panelists to ask each other's questions, because I'm sure that you all have a lot of questions for each other. But perhaps we can start, and sorry, that's like the professor in me. Can we define what AI is? Does anyone want to jump here? Just because that may kind of set the tone for the rest of the day.
Don't ask the historian to define artificial intelligence.
So I'll jump in. All right.
So PhD in computer science is kind of jumping in.
So I'll use the definition that I don't think it is the appropriate definition to use in all contexts, but I'll use the definition that I'm applying in this context of this symposium, which is actually potentially a little bit broader than maybe a traditional definition of AI, because I fold into AI basically any algorithmic decision-making system that is automatically making a decision without a human in the loop. And that's definitely broader. Most people, when they think about AI, they think about, it has to be deep neural networks or things like that. But for me, a algorithmic decision-making system doesn't have to have deep neural networks behind it to implicate human rights. And so, in fact, and I bet the next panel will talk a lot about in the discrimination, the criminal justice sense, like some of these things are like literally like worksheets. Like if your total is more than 5, do X. If your total is more than 7, do Y. And that can have, because it is an algorithmic system, it can still have human rights implications. So I'm actually going to go with a very broad definition.
How do people feel about that on the panel?
I would like to broaden it even further in the sense that sometimes I feel like we could walk into the trap of only thinking about artificial intelligence when we think about disruptive technology and business. So we've written papers on artificial intelligence and human rights that starts with a definition of what artificial intelligence is. But actually when we started working with companies on these issues, blockchain, 5G, Internet of Things, there are so many ways in which technology is disrupting business that there's a risk that we're so focused on artificial intelligence, we actually don't pay enough attention to other technologies. So I would just want to broaden it even further.
Great. I guess one thing I would add is that artificial intelligence benefits from massive data collection and violation of privacy, because, or not always, but with the massive data, you can make better decisions in artificial intelligence. So I think there's that tension that should be noted as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I guess the only thing I would add is I think that a lot of the problems that we think about when we think about the problems of AI are problems of any technology that scales. I think a lot of it is just about scaling limitlessly, and that's where a lot of these challenges come in.
I love this definition. So we have different aspects here, right? We have the kind of automation aspect and the idea of like kind of automated decision making that can be as simple as kind of flagging or kind of checklists, basically, could kind of work in that domain. We have the question of scale. We have the question of the amount of data that's being mined and collected and what that means for the people involved. I think that what's interesting is when we kind of thinking about all of your remarks, is that like when we think about free speech, though, we usually think about these very complex algorithmic systems that kind of rely on machine learning in some kind of ways, or not always, right? So we think about the Facebook feed, we think about bots and how they kind of act online. We think about Twitter and other platforms. And so I guess that one aspect that came out from many of your kind of interventions is that it's tough. Right? It's complicated. And it's complicated in several ways. It's complicated because there is always a tension between, on the one hand, moderation and kind of making sure that hate speech may not be kind of reproduced online, and on the other hand, surveillance and lack of due process, especially when this kind of moderation is being done at scale and through automated means. And that kind of connects, in my opinion, with another problem which all of you touched on, which is the fact that algorithms and AI technologies are very much human technologies, right? In two senses. First, in the sense that it's always humans who design these systems, and so that a lot of questions come in the design process. And second is the fact that humans manipulate bots and feeds and artificial intelligence. And so I guess I have a question on these two things. The first one is, what do you think can be done, and you already talked a bit about this, Andy, but for the other panelists as well, on the design side of these bots and feeds, among other things? And second, how can we think about this kind of human manipulation aspect? And you know, most of you talked about kind of bad manipulation. I like the terminology of bad actors. That's kind of, it remains kind of nicely vague. You know, it's just like, they're bad. But so how do we know what's a bad actor compared to a good one, right? And so, for example, like in my case, like, so I studied web journalists for many years and how they kind of adjust their content production to maximize their impact online. And many of them are very savvy about what's successful on social media platforms, and they keep changing their headlines and their pictures and everything to kind of maximize impact. And so is that a good thing or a bad thing? How do we think about these boundaries? And so these are two different questions for the panelists, one about design and second about manipulation, good or bad. Who wants to start?
Well, one thing that comes to mind when you mention all these factors is just the overwhelming amount of information that exists right now and the overwhelming noise and how difficult it is. Like that is a factor of the democratization of expression and access to information, but it also makes it more difficult to discern good information from bad information, you know, high quality from low quality. And so when there's all this information, obviously journalists and other people are going to try and game the algorithms to get their opinion out, just as people who are trying to manipulate public opinion with, you know, national security or other, or, you know, attacking ideas, wanting to target individuals, are going to use coordinated doxing attacks, coordinated by trolls. So I think that I don't have a solution, but I always want to contextualize it where I'm like, I think we're in this age of just so much overwhelming information. And it's like, that's changed throughout time. And what direction do we think we're going to be going with regard to just the context of the information environment as well?
I think I'm afraid I'm going to broaden it out again.
That's a historian.
Maybe this is the, in fact, this probably is the historian's perspective. So when we undertake human rights impact assessments for companies in this industry, looking at, you know, the human rights impacts of a social media platform or the way in which technology is being used, we spend a lot of time obviously looking at the technology and the design phase you've just talked about and how speech is moderated online, all of this stuff. But what always strikes me is the social, economic, historical context in which all of that exists. And sometimes I fear that we get so focused on the technology that we forget the broader social, economic, historical, political context. Mm-hmm. So how do we sustainably address hate speech and violence, incitement to violence over time? Counter-speech efforts, peace resolution efforts, addressing the root causes of human rights violations in whatever social, political, geographical context we're talking about is absolutely essential, and we shouldn't take our eye off that long-term ball. Mm-hmm. So I guess the historian on the table totally recognizes the significance of technology and of addressing the spreading of hate speech and bad content by bad actors for all the reasons you've described. But I guess it's an appeal not to forget the broader systemic historical context.
Oh, Andy, look.
Well, I feel like this is a little discordant with what you just said, so I'm reluctant. But just
they can exist alongside.
Yeah. So I guess I'll just zoom out a little in a different direction, which is when we think about bad content, bad behavior, problematic bad actors, if you will. There's sort of three things you can do at a high level when you, as a company, when you encounter problematic content. You can remove it, you can reduce its distribution, or you can inform people with different information when they encounter that. And so that's whenever we think about a problem area or behavior area or a different product surface, that's sort of the framework we use. You have the intervention, which is one of those three. You have the surface, you have the actor, and you have like the problem area. So if you take like misinformation as an example, in the remove bucket, our strategy is you remove fake accounts. So you go to our transparency report, I think you'll see that we removed like 1.1 billion fake accounts in the fourth quarter. You can remove people who are bullying, harassing, hate speech, which is often correlated with misinformation in certain contexts. You move to the reduce bucket, you can look for proxies of misinformation, things like clickbait, ad farms, but also you can have direct signal from like fact checkers, and you can use all that signal to reduce the distribution of content that doesn't violate your policies, but is the kind of content that people tell us they don't want to interact with, and so you reduce its distribution in feed and search, et cetera. And then you can inform people. And so if Dunstan and I are close friends on Facebook, and actually we in fact are, if we're close friends and he's posted misinformation, but we're such close friends that I keep interacting with his stuff and I scroll in my feed for a long time, and so sort of the reduce actions don't work in that sense, and I come across his post, in that situation we will attach the debunking article from the fact checker who has told us that that is false. In addition, we'll have a thing called the context button. So on any link posted to Facebook, there's this little eye, and if you click on it, a little micro page will pop up with context about the publisher, like its Wikipedia entry, other articles it's published, and that's like another surface that we're going to continue to iterate on and add more information to provide people more context.
Great, that's super helpful.
I mean, I already mentioned a little bit, but it seems like in terms of the design angle, when you're dealing with this sort of thing, user empowerment seems like a big part of the design in terms of letting, and Katie mentioned it too, letting the users decide this is the sort of thing I want to see, this is the sort of thing I don't want to see. And you can still leverage, I mean, there's some, because of the massive amount of information, there's still some sort of automation needed to be able to group these things. But it's a very different model than I get what's on my feed and Facebook gets to determine what shows up on my feed. And they might tell me why, but they get to determine what's on my feed based on some actions that I don't fully have, the exact model. I don't have a direct way of providing feedback saying, yes, I want more of this, no, I want more of that, or I want this completely separate thing that you didn't even think of. And I think, if we give people more control over what they see, then people will have less to worry about bots spreading fake news, because people, presumably, if people really think this is bad, people won't want to see this sort of stuff.
Can I push back a little on that?
Go ahead. Yeah, because I was going actually to say, it seems like many of some of the developments that you're talking about do give more control to users, right? But perhaps the nature of the feed itself is that. But I will let you elaborate on this.
So I love to saying take a step back. So let's take a step back. What is feed trying to do? So on newsfeed on Facebook, you choose all the content that goes in your feed. You choose to follow people, to become friends with people, to follow pages, and to join groups. That action constitutes your newsfeed inventory. So all of the posts from your friends that you choose and the pages you choose to follow, all that ends up in your newsfeed. The problem is there's about 3,000 posts per day in your newsfeed. And you're only realistically going to spend enough time to see a couple hundred of them, like 200, 300 posts if you're a really good Facebook user. I encourage you to see more of them. But the sorting action is the service that we provide to people, so that of those 3,000 posts, the stuff at the top is going to be the stuff that they find most meaningful. And so that's what feed ranking is trying to do. It's trying to optimize for what will you say is the most meaningful content to you of all the stuff you chose to follow. And so giving people more control beyond the fact that they 100% control, like what goes into their feed, is something we're completely aligned with. And so, for example, you can go to your newsfeed preferences and you can say, see first, and you can pick a bunch of friends and say, put all their stuff at the top of the feed, notwithstanding anything else. That's an example. You can also snooze certain people. You can say snooze Dunstan for 30 days. He's been posting a lot about Game of Thrones, and I'm sick of it. He actually hasn't been, but so you can snooze people. We actually used to have a thing where you could say see more like this and see less like this, and people didn't like it because they found it confusing. But in general, that's the problem we're trying to solve. That's what we're optimizing for. And to the extent that there are controls and signals that people can more explicitly give us, that's great.
Yes.
That's very interesting. I wanted to jump on Jeremy's point because I actually heard from Kit Walsh from EFF a really interesting idea that's not my own, it's Kit's, that of the idea of looking beyond just the news feed that we're looking at now and saying, I want to follow someone who can curate the news feed for me. So it's not just following the posts of someone on Twitter who's you're looking at all their posts, or looking at someone on Facebook's page and seeing all the things that are shared on that page, but actually having someone who is like, I'm a good curator. I follow, these are my passions, and now you're going to see like news feeds that are based off of that curation. And I thought that was a very interesting idea because it's a personal connection with the person who you're trusting to be your curator. And it's kind of, that labor is, is getting paid, so that person's being given credit for that. And also there's less disinformation, and you also know, it's more personal, trustworthy, yeah.
I mean, I think that what's fascinating here is that in a way we are like returning to journalism, right? In the sense that like journalists like see themselves as like enlightened curators. They're the ones kind of who rely on like 2 centuries of professionalization to kind of tell you what's important in the news of the day, right? And so what's interesting is kind of like another model of kind of professionalized curation or enlightened curation or something to go against kind of mechanical curation, if that makes sense. I mean, that's probably not the right way of saying, but I mean, I think that there is an agreement among everybody that there is too much content to be seen, and so it has to be sorted. Let us note that this is not a new problem in the sense that already in the 18th century, people were complaining that there was too much to know, right? And they were just like, how can we do this? How can I read all the books, right? And so in many ways, like this is not new. But now we do have these technologies that automate. And so I would like to give the rest of the panel a chance to react to what has just been said.
So it's not new, but it plays out differently in different contexts. And what's been occurring to me with this discussion is the link between the technical solutions we've been talking about and the broader social political context that I was mentioning. So some of the options that Andy mentioned in terms of why you're seeing this post, where's it coming from, the fact-checking solutions. For us in cultures and countries where we're used to freedom of expression, where we're used to being exposed to a diverse range of news sources, some of that might seem sort of a bit obvious, and you might skim over it and not even know that it's there. In different countries, in different cultures, where they're suddenly getting from close to zero to an explosion of news and information, those types of solutions can become tremendously important in terms of raising awareness about the merits of different sources, the trustworthiness of different types of information. And so I think it's sometimes easy for us in the West, I guess, to underestimate the significance of those solutions, when in a different context they may get a lot more attention and have a different significance. So yes, these problems are not new in many ways, but actually they do play out very differently in different contexts.
Mm-hmm. Certainly so. You're good?
Yeah. Can I just...
yeah.
Sure. Actually, go ahead.
One other point I want to make is I think, at least on Facebook, almost everything that happens on Facebook is personal communication. It's friends talking about private issues. Mm-hmm. Only a very small slice of what happens on Facebook is news or public like broadly defined news. And so that's another sort of challenge that we face. So the ideas about having like other people manually curate stuff might make sense when you're talking about public content, but when 95% of what's in your feed is like, my sister went to this restaurant and this photo of so-and-so, doesn't, one, there are sort of privacy issues with having other people curate that, but 2, it's not clear at all why they would have the ability to do so usefully. But for sort of journalistic content, there's definitely merit in that kind of idea.
But so let me just ask, because Facebook went back and forth, right, about how to prioritize, and correct me if I'm not right, about how to prioritize kind of news type content versus personal content, right, on the timeline. I mean, I certainly know that from the point of view of news organizations, they saw like big ups and downs in traffic coming from Facebook based on the changes in the news feed. Is that a correct assumption or description of
Yes,
what
I mean, I would just the quick summary would be about, I guess, last January, so almost a year and a half ago, we announced that based on social science research about passive consumption of media versus active engagement with social media, we decided that we were going to relatively increase the distribution of friend content relative to page content. And so page content went down about 20% on Facebook. And that's how large organizations tend to distribute their content on Facebook, is through pages.
And so just to like push you a tiny bit further, perhaps, and drawing on what Jeremy was saying, in terms of like kind of procedural due process, right? And kind of putting users in control, was that, how did you communicate to users about this change? I mean, was it transparent, or what kind of efforts were made to explain this kind of switch?
Yeah. So Mark did a post, talked to, I think, every major journalistic outlet. We did a newsroom post from our head of news feed, explained what we were doing and why. That was our strategy. So it definitely didn't go under the radar. It was a big announcement that we were proud of. And just to say another word about the sort of social science piece of it, which is essentially the state of research at the time, and I don't know if it's changed, was that active engagement on social media, commenting, talking with your friends and family, was associated with good mental health outcomes, self-reported happiness, indicators of depression, whereas sort of passive consumption of video in particular, just watching stuff on social media, didn't appear to be associated with positive outcomes.
I just want, Dustin, thank you for reminding us that, to look beyond the U.S. context, because it is such a big theme on this panel, AI and free speech. It's easy to get siloed. And so one thing I want to point out is in our studies of propaganda, we're seeing much more propaganda and disinformation and coordinated harassment being discussed and coordinated on encrypted messaging channels, and especially in other countries. And that's difficult because you can't look in there and study, and the ways in which we can study is people who are in the channels, sharing the information. But it's like, that's a whole nother issue where AI moderation of hate speech is not going to be applied, to my knowledge, on encrypted channels. And I'm just wondering how we're going to deal with that going forward.
So actually, I can throw out there, EFF has actually heard that some government regulators want to push for local AI filtering on encrypted channels. And for us, that makes that channel no longer end-to-end encrypted. When the message is not going directly from one user to the other, we're not talking about end-to-end encrypted messaging anymore. We're talking about the platform is inserting itself in your messaging system. And so the one thing that I would actually applaud Facebook for doing, this is a thing that EFF asked them to do earlier this year, and they went ahead and rolled it out, that I think will help with this to some degree, is on WhatsApp, you can now decline to be put into a group in terms of a group message. Before, you just automatically, if someone wanted to message 100 people, you would just get pulled into that group. And they've made a change now with the way that's set up. And so now, if you don't want to be pulled into that, and you don't want to be exposed to that misinformation, it's still an end-to-end encrypted messaging system. But again, this is about the solution was more user control. And I think that's a pretty positive approach.
And when you're in an end-to-end, when you're in a messaging environment, this ranking situation doesn't happen. Right. So insofar as in our remove, reduce, inform framework, reduce is through ranking. You lose that in the messaging context, but you can still use things like friction, like limiting the number of people that can be in a group, or limiting the number of times a message can be re-forwarded, or adding a click. Those kinds of friction-y things are still an option for reducing content in that context, but you lack direct signal about the nature of the content to trigger those different friction points. So it is a very challenging space, and we're going to have to continue to invest and figure out how to tackle it more effectively.
Yeah. I think this is fascinating. I mean, first, I really like that we touch even kind of superficially, but on question of global reach, because I think that one of the things that's absolutely fascinating with social media platforms today is that you basically are playing a role. They are basically playing a role across borders in a way that few, if none, of the media companies of previous decades and century ever played. And so that raises a question of how a framework designed in Menlo Park, right, and an infrastructure kind of designed in the Bay Area can scale, and in scaling kind of can adjust and adapt to local contexts that may have very different characteristics and sets of meanings compared to the ones in kind of Western Europe and the United States. And so there have been like a lot of kind of scandals recently about users of social media platform for hate speech and discrimination. I'm thinking of Myanmar, India, and a lot of other places. And that's certainly a complex set of questions. I mean, I don't mean to say that there is an easy answer, but certainly some design interventions like the one you're talking about play an important part. Yeah.
It's tremendously complex. So the question becomes, well, what do you do about it? And what do you do about it from a human rights point of view? So one of the things we've been thinking through is if you do have this global platform and a huge number of different contexts, how do you prioritize attention and intervention from a human rights-based approach, right? So where in the world are the greatest human rights risks? Where will human rights violations that might be associated with online content be most severe, be most prominent, impact the most number of people?
No.
And they're not necessarily the things that are in the news today. Right? So and maybe Andy can speak more to this, but what's the process to think ahead? You know, where should we be thinking about hotspots from a human rights point of view that will arise over the next 2, 3, 5 years? And I think it is very easy to get focused on or have one narrative, right, about the relationship between social media and hate speech and violence, when it can be very different in different contexts. And think about Cambodia, for example, where in Cambodia newspapers have been shut down. They've been bought by politicians or business people that have one particular point of view. So what was free press in Cambodia doesn't really exist anymore, but it does on Facebook. And so in Cambodia, the news feed as it relates to TV and print media being shared on the Facebook platform by groups that are now in exile and are not able to operate inside Cambodia is tremendously important. But that's a completely different context than in Myanmar. And we run the risk of having this one narrative when in fact there are, I guess, hundreds of narratives.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, good. So can I ask you a couple of questions, because I was really curious about a couple of things you mentioned that are going on at Facebook, and knowing that these are complex questions again. So the first one was again relating to the question of control and like empowerment of the users. I was really curious about what you said about how the feed is a choice of the users because it's based on users' kind of past history and past kind of behavior, right, and the kind of choices that you make. And I find that really interesting, but a bit Jesuitic, I guess. I mean, would be my kind of French thing. I mean, it's a bit like, so, okay, but so then is like me being tracked by like online advertising also my choice, right? It's like me receiving kind of ads for like whatever, like dental implants, like that is also based, I guess, on my online tracking. I say that because I saw that on my whatever, like New York Times yesterday. I was like, wow, interesting.
I have a fake tooth. So.
Yeah, listen, I don't know. I was just like, hey, I wonder what can. Okay, but so I just find it kind of. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on that, because, and that's a term that hasn't been brought up so far, which is the idea of filter bubbles and echo chambers, right? And of course, the research on the actual impact of these filter bubbles and echo chambers is kind of complicated. To some extent, it's a moral panic about kind of how it shapes expression. But there is certainly an aspect, I think, in Eli Pariser's original definition, which is that it's this feeling of powerlessness that we don't really know what's going on, what are the mechanisms that drive the kind of information that users see, right? So it's kind of opacity, powerlessness, etc. And so I just wanted to like kind of push back a bit on your definitions. And I have a second question, but I'll keep it short.
Well, so on the sort of opacity, powerlessness, I think that that might be a fair characterization of the way systems operated like 5 years ago. But now the sort of a lot of the information is out there, and if anything, we're struggling to figure out like what additional information about how systems are architected would be useful to disclose. And we have sort of this ongoing commitment to publish anytime we make a significant ranking change. So if people have specific ideas about how to get architectural information out there, let us know. On the sort of point about, I guess it's just a more fundamental point about like the limits of controls to give people. I do think it's important to acknowledge that like on the one hand, there are sort of content issues where it's about like personal preference and like maybe I don't want to see profanity and like I'm not that, you know, I have like a pretty low tolerance for sexually suggestive content or graphic violence. But on the other hand, there's content that is like destructive to society, and that's the content that we feel is important to remove under our community standards. And you know, drawing that line is difficult, and like that is part of the consultative process that we run through our content standards forum. But it's not the case that we would build a control and to let people opt in to seeing terrorism and incitements to genocide. But it does seem reasonable that we would build more controls to allow people to optimize for the level of sexually suggestive content or graphic violence, potentially, although that, you know, I mean, you can see right there that like maybe that actually is in the other bucket. So it's not that control is unambiguously good in this context.
Absolutely.
Although I do think we need to do a lot more, just to be clear.
So I actually want to intersect that and push back and intersect that with the idea of scaling, because once you talk about scaling, you are talking about automated systems, and you're talking about systems that don't know the difference between incitement to genocide and criticism of a piece that is quoting something that is incitement to genocide. AI systems are still struggling very much with context. And so that is an area where I think actually saying, no, we don't ever want users to see this ends up actually erring on the side of taking down oftentimes counter speech. And this seems like an area where it would be much better to give users control and say, you know, and maybe the default is you don't see it, but for users who don't want to be subject to this algorithm that is, you know, not necessarily very good at figuring out what is and isn't bad speech, giving them that opportunity to say, I want to judge that for myself.
This time it's not me.
So I guess two responses. So one would be, I think that the systems are continuing to get better and better, and I think the examples that you cited in your opening remarks are like almost, I'm sure they're true if you said them, but like those are things that, as they're identified as flaws, can be addressed over time. The problem is there will always be an enormous amount of anecdotes people can point to, because we at Facebook get like over 1 million reports per day of content alleged to violate our community standards. So even if we're right 99.9% of the time, there's 100,000 anecdotes newspapers could write about every day if they choose to. That's not to diminish those cases. Like those are real problems, people having real bad experiences. And so then you have to have, and we do now, an appeal system, so you can appeal to us in the first instance and we can try to fix it. And then hopefully by the end of the year, an external body if we're still making the wrong decision. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it.
I'm curious, and forgive me if it's there, but does Facebook publish the false positive rate for automated takedowns in its transparency report?
No.
Maybe you should, to convince us that it's just anecdotes and not a large number.
Yeah.
So
we have a transparency report coming out very soon.
I hope that's in there.
And once again, the idea of the panel is not to put you on the spot. It's just like it's so fascinating to get someone from Facebook who can actually kind of tell us about the kind of complicated decision and hard work that gets into making these decisions. I think that no one here is denying the fact that these are just very complex decisions to make. And so talking about complex decisions, I'm sorry, but I'm like going to ask, of course, about the decision to ban alt-right kind of celebrity figures, I guess we could say, over the past couple of days. I'm thinking of, well, you know their names better than I do, but
Milo,
Milo
Alex
Yiannopoulos
Jones,
and Alex Jones, etc. And how, I mean, media reports kind of described it as a bit of a messy process, in the sense that the news leaked before they were actually banned, and so they were able, in some cases, to tell their followers to follow them to other platforms. And so I'm wondering, for example, the right to appeal, is it something that you will grant them? Or like, is it possible to expand a bit on that kind of decision, which seems, on the one hand, something that was called for by many places, but on the other hand, something that puts Facebook in a tough spot, in the sense that Facebook tries really hard not to describe itself as a media company that makes censorship decisions, right? I mean, in the sense of banning people from the platform, and yet that's what you're doing. So,
So just on that, like,
Yeah.
we've always had an authentic name policy. So you have to be using your real name on Facebook. That's not to say people don't have fake accounts. We think at any given time, 3 to 4%. In a quarter, we think we take down about 1 billion. So we've always had like an identity and access policy. We also have never allowed hate figures, terrorists. If you're a terrorist leader, it's not just that you can't post terrorism on Facebook, you just can't be there. Similarly with hate figures. And so that's not a new thing in that sense. And the process for making those decisions is pretty robust, and it's principally based on their behavior on Facebook, because that is the information to which we most easily have access. But in situations where we can or do become aware of additional context beyond what's on Facebook, we're going to use that information to help our assessment about whether someone falls into one of these categories of prohibited actors. I wasn't involved in this particular takedown, but this kind of process of identifying people who should not be using our services is a thing that we sort of, there's a team that does that all the time, and that's what they do. And I think in this case, it's people who are particularly in the public eye.
Yeah. Does anyone on the panel want to react or add something to the discussion? And if not, we're going to open it up for Q&A, knowing that we can also, of course, participants in the panel can also ask questions to the rest of the panelists. Okay, questions? So we're going to start in the back. Yeah.
We'll bring some microphones up.
Hi, I have a question regarding international law, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Does that come into play here from anybody's vantage point? And I mention that because I really hear nothing about that in the media. And I'm wondering, is that because people are really giving it up to the corporations to figure out, and countries to regulate that, and people to put pressure and so forth? So what are the thoughts on that?
To answer the question, what's the role of the Universal Declaration of
What's
Human Rights?
What's the role of international law inclusive of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
So, in particular, when we're undertaking human rights impact assessments for companies, we will use the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Bill of Human Rights, and all the relevant covenants as the place we go to systematically identify what impacts the company is having. And so in the opening remarks, we had this discussion around the importance of a human rights-based approach to supplement an ethics-based approach, and it is precisely for that reason. An ethics-based approach, you're not drawing from any one particular sort of standard. You might address really important questions about fairness and distribution and bias, right? They're very important ethics questions at stake. But the reason for emphasizing a human rights-based approach is to use precisely those documents to go through in a very systematic way. What is the impact on privacy? What is the impact on the right to marriage, the right to participate in government, all the various different rights? So I would see them as central. And we're seeing a lot more companies make very specific commitments to human rights standards than we did 5-10 years ago. And that's quite an encouraging sign.
And I would just add, so the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights sort of translate that international human rights law that as it relates to governments into the context for how businesses should operate. And then the Global Network Initiative is the ICT sector's specific commitments and sort of translation of the UN guiding principles for the tech sector. And so you can go to globalnetworkinitiative.org and sort of see how that's translated into the specific issues that tech platforms deal with. And we're a member, and then we're audited biannually.
I'll just mention that's a great point, because as we all know, there are many social media companies that are operating in authoritarian countries and are created by authoritarian countries and work with the government to suppress human rights activists and journalists. And it's, if all other companies are able to rally around this, UN Declaration of Human Rights, perhaps there can be more decisive action taken against social media companies that violate human rights.
I think the challenge comes when you're operating in countries where the local law violates international human rights standards. And what does a company do in that context? And the answer might vary significantly from, let's say, a telecommunications company that might have licenses in a country, staff in a country. They would have a very different answer to the question than, say, a social media company that may have a lot of presence in the sense that their service is used, but no staff, no equipment, no particular license. So you get into this very challenging question: what does the company do if international human rights and the local law are in conflict?
I would just to add to that, we are compelled to take down content by governments in situations where we don't think it's appropriate that the content be removed. And in those situations, we notify the user of what happened and why. And we also put it in that biannual transparency report that I mentioned. So there's sort of specific transparency to the affected user and general transparency to the government or to the world. And sort of the process by which we sort of push back, assess the validity, et cetera, is what is spelled out in those GNI implementation guidelines that I mentioned.
You focus mostly in social media in this panel. And I think sometimes you're kind of mixing privacy and free speech. So my question is if you think social media is the biggest threat to free speech from the AR perspective, compared with other issues like surveillance states, machine behavior, etc.
Can you clarify the question just a little bit?
You spoke mostly about social media in this free speech panel. So you think social media is the biggest threat from the AI perspective to free speech? If the surveillance states, machine behavior, many other things that are more AI related are not biggest threat than just social media?
I would hesitate to sort of reach a conclusion as to which the biggest threat is, but I think the spirit of the question is there are a wide range of different risks to freedom of expression beyond social media. And I would say absolutely yes. If you think about how facial recognition will be used across multiple industries and how that may be used in different countries, and add on to that Internet of Things, add on to that the way in which AI might be used in different sectors, cumulatively, that's a big impact. And again, going back to the importance of a human rights-based approach, the interdependency of privacy, freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of expression. We have to think of these things as one holistic whole. And it's great to have a deep dive onto one part. It's very important. But I think that integrated whole is significant as well. But I'd hesitate to say one is more important than the other.
I would also add that social media often does act as a surveillance tool, and that the surveillance is a great threat to freedom of speech. And I think the big question is how do we move towards social media not being used as a surveillance tool, and that large part has to do with data collection.
I have two clarifications. Excuse me. I'm having a little hard time. So I think the real name policy that you mentioned, I wanted to know, like, in 2014, Facebook has apologized to kings and queens, the drag of king and queen of LGBT community. And Facebook allowed them to have dual names because they wanted to protect their policy. So as that policy has gone, do they have to use the real name now? Because you said you have a policy of using real names. Right, that's the first clarification. And the second clarification is, I think that's more general for all of the panel. It would be celebration of colonial historical symbols that could be offensive towards a lot of colonial population. For example, Robert E. Lee's statues to be removed, and should be removed or not be removed. So coming to Facebook AI, when it detects that merciless Indian savages should be removed, then they had to give him a pass because it was an American constitution. But on the other hand, it was very offensive towards local native Indian or Indian abroad or anywhere, the colonial population. So how would you create a balance when it creates some kind of conflict towards hate content? Because it's hate content.
So on the real name, authentic name thing, so the idea, if you rewind to 2004, try to put your head in 2004 and you go online, there was nowhere where you could go where you actually knew who you were interacting with or had any reasonable expectation that you were talking to like a real person as opposed to someone pretending to be someone they're not. And so that was like, we think a huge part of the breakthrough of Facebook was you knew who you were talking to and you had a reasonable expectation that the person behind the screen was who you thought they were. And we think that's essential to building the kind of community that people want on Facebook. And so the authentic name policy is about making sure that you on Facebook are matched to who you are in real life in the way that the people you interact with know you. And so it's not about your legal name. It's not about like what's on your passport. Like my passport doesn't say Andy. But it's about do people in your life match that name with you? And so in the example of like drag queens, while that's hard to do at scale, insofar as who they were known as to their community matched their Facebook presence, that's in keeping with the spirit of that policy. So sort of nicknames, other names that sort of are your professional names or your private names that you go by with your communities, as long as they sort of match your real life name, that's within sort of the spirit. But again, that's hard to do at scale. And so it's a constant pain point. No. Yeah, we want we want people to have one account that is who they really are. Yeah. And then what was the second part? Oh. Yeah, I think that this goes back to that sort of what is the reason people find a particular type of content problematic? Is it because it's socially destructive or is it because it's personally offensive? And I think this is an example that sort of illustrates the difficulty of it. If that's the kind of content that you find offensive, then maybe that's not the kind of content that should be at the top of your feed, for example, or maybe that's the kind of content that you should have a control to hide. But is that the kind of content that we should prohibit people from expressing? I think in that case, it's clear that because it's a historical document of such significance, we certainly shouldn't prevent people from sharing it. But it illustrates the difficulty of making these decisions.
So I just wanted to, I think, well, most of you know that there's going to be a Tech for Humanity summit in Paris in about 10 days with the digital ministers from around the world. And that's addressing in part, they'll have a social media summit there as well, addressing in part, terrorist activities which have used social media platforms. And one of my concerns with the use of words like terrorism is that I find it quite divisive, because you do have groups who, say with the Christchurch attack, that was soon followed after with the attack on Catholic churches in Sri Lanka, which was claimed by ISIS to be a retaliation for what happened to their people in Christchurch. So when you use words like terrorism or bad actors to malign groups, it's kind of provocative in some sense. So how do we not malign them further by taking down their content necessarily or repressing free speech of these minority groups and malign groups? How do you bring them into the conversation to say, how do we address your concerns? How do we, understand the cause for your actions that we see as bad acting? Because governments have also been bad actors. For persecuted communities, they would consider governments to be bad actors. So how do we, I don't know if I've articulated myself quite well, but yeah, what do you think?
I think this raises really interesting question, both about the definition of bad actor and the fact that, like, it's, shall we say, a category whose boundaries are a bit fluid, to say the least. And so I'm kind of also interested in bad actor for whom, I guess. And I think that the second point that you're making is really interesting, right? Which is like the kind of censorship versus dialogue, and how do you kind of negotiate these different options?
Yeah, I would say I use the term bad actor to be purposefully vague because people do move in and out of both sides. But one issue with terrorists, especially the terrorist who committed the atrocity in Christchurch, he knew how to manipulate media. He was extremely media literate and was replicating a pattern that we see across white supremacist terrorists who are using live streaming, distribution of manifestos, reaching out to all these media, and that incites further attacks. And so that's the problem. And in this shooting that happened in the synagogue in San Diego last week, he actually cited the killer or the terrorist in Christchurch, and that's the issue of social media. Actually, we don't want terrorists to be able to manipulate social media to incite further terrorism, no matter what demographic or who you are. And I think with what you're saying about bringing people back into the fold is very important, and I think about that with regard to polarization, debated polarization in the U.S. And I'm going to misquote this, but in The Art of War, there's a quote that's, you want to build a golden bridge so the enemy can return back into the community. And that is a longer term question of how do we make sure that these conversations don't just always malign one actor, but I think that's because it's like an immediate response out of fear. And that's also in part due to the social media and the information environment we're in right now that's very reliant on virality and emotional content. And if we create a space that doesn't allow terrorists to spread, really provocative live-streamed images that some lonely person who's in their room is like, yeah, I'm going to blame that one group and say that they're the person for all my issues. Like, we need to make a social media environment that, like we were discussing, that doesn't allow extremist content to reach people disproportionately in comparison to the good content. Because I do believe that people are innately good and they want to make good decisions, but sometimes you're put in a context that make you extreme. So
maybe I would just add. So I'm not a terrorism expert, but we have a whole team, sort of led by the guy who literally wrote the book on ISIS, and their sort of considered judgment is that the best way to address these concerns and the issues that you talked about is to take an aggressive stand. And we do not allow, it's not even just, as I discussed earlier, that we don't allow terrorist individuals and terrorist organizations themselves to act in any capacity, but you also can't praise or express support for those organizations and individuals. And so we take an aggressive stand on that. And sort of that is the result of sort of the expert consultations on this.
So I was just to follow that up. So from taking that aggressive stance, in some way, I wonder how can you bring, decrease the malalignment for ISIS saying. So by taking an aggressive stance, they will feel even more malaligned. Trying to draw backs to engender their agenda, to try and improve their agenda. So how do we bring them back into control of this line?
And I'm thinking also just adding on to that terrorism is one case, but for example, the alt-right also uses kind of malign identity, right, to kind of depict themselves as victims of the mainstream and the mainstream media and liberal tech corporations, etc. And so it certainly plays into their kind of representation of themselves as being oppressed, right, which in turn is a big part of the message that they kind of give their followers, and that often goes viral.
I'll just follow on that one moment. That yes, they do use the martyrship, and I think that that's actually more another evidence of their extreme media literacy and knowledge of how to manipulate the media environment. Because, like you're saying, you can control ranking algorithms. I think the response to terrorist recruitment is actually to diminish their reach and not do it in an overt way that shows that they are martyrs. But because terrorists, especially alt-right and white supremacist terrorists, are very adept at manipulating search engine optimization and getting their message out there. So I don't think it's that we should be taking and I think that Facebook, from my understanding when I was understanding Facebook's relationship with ISIS recruitment that was occurring and how they interact with the government and academics to study recruitment tactics and kind of approach it at the source. It wasn't like a top-down, we're kicking off all these people. It was, what are the psychological tactics that recruiters are using on Facebook Messenger, and how can we diminish the reach of that? And I think that we should not be allowing terrorists to manipulate media to spread their messages, and that it should be done in a more nuanced and covert way. Yeah.
Hi, my question is primarily for Andy. You talked about content moderation policies and also developing a potential external oversight board. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit what steps you've taken or you will take to sort of incorporate different regional sensibilities into these decisions and make sure that the decision-making process of the potential board and also these policies are not extremely US-centric, given that Facebook is a global company.
A good question. So what we've done, so we announced, I guess, I don't even remember what we announced it, November, I think. We announced that we were going to build this board and that we were going to run essentially a year-long consultative process. And so what we've done is we have had now 4 sort of large conferences in different parts of the world. So we did Singapore, India, Singapore, New Delhi, we're about to do Mexico City, New York, Berlin. We did one other that's escaping me. Anyway, we did a bunch of big events, and then we did a number of dozens of small events with 20 people, and walk through a series of open questions, get their feedback. In addition to that, we actually currently have a public consultation open. So you can go and go online and essentially provide your feedback in sort of essay format on how the board should operate. And I think that closes on May 13th. So I think you have 9 days if you want to go, and there's sort of a structured input section and then an open input section. I think to sort of fast forward to how are we going to ensure geographic diversity and regional sensitivity, I think there's essentially going to be 2 components to it. One will be the diversity of the membership of the board itself. And then second will be figuring it, because no matter how diverse the board is in and of itself, it can't be infinitely diverse. So it can't have infinite expertise in everything that might come before it. So the second piece would be building mechanisms for them to tap into specific types of expertise. And I don't know how we're going to solve that, but we need to find a way to solve that. So that's how we're thinking about it.
I think there's 2 things that are sometimes put in tension, and there's some tension between them, but also I'd like to think they can coexist. So on the one hand, approaches that understand local context and local culture and local priorities. On the other hand, human rights are by their nature universal, right? And those 2 things coexist. We often get asked, how can you take this human rights-based approach and isn't that a sort of culturally Western approach to take? Well, I've never had that experience. Every time I've engaged with rights holders in non-Western countries where human rights are at risk, the actual rights holders have a great sense of their rights. So sometimes it's placed as if the 2 are in conflict. How can you take a human rights-based approach and respect local culture at the same time, as if those 2 are in conflict? And I understand that tension, but my experience has been it's not really there once you actually speak to the people whose lives are being impacted.
Oh, hi. So I'd like to build on that, and then I was very curious about your discussion of unintended consequences, but I would ask the panel about maybe one that's coming back to human rights, which might be good about some of the things that we're seeing with AI. For example, we haven't really talked about, there's US conceptions of free speech, but there's a very different model in Europe that's very concerned about hate speech and incitement of violence. And then we're not operating in a vacuum. We see sort of increasing violence that's occurred, in particular linked to, so I'll take the example of the Jewish communities, and linking of more and more anti-immigrant sentiment. So what I would kind of invite the panel to talk about is, how does this demonstrate maybe failures or tensions between US conceptions of free speech and human rights conceptions of what should be the right balance. And maybe we could just articulate it with more specificity for this audience who might not understand that tension. Maybe, Angele, you have a kind of background in Europe, so I made part of it, and some others. Thank you.
I mean, I think that it's really so interesting, actually, to kind of address the paradox that's built in the title of this panel, and so that's kind of what panels like to do, is kind of dissolve the panel at the end of the panel, right, and saying well, actually, should we even be on this panel? Which I guess is one way of doing it. But it's true that and that's I think a question for the other panelists, that the US-based definition of free speech is a very encompassing one. And free speech is very much protected to the extent that censorship is just really seen as a problematic and hard thing to do in the US compared to, for example, France, where I'm from, and which has a much more, shall we say, encompassing policy in terms of kind of removing hate speech and putting it into law. And so I don't know what people think. Do you think that this idea of free speech is something that needs to be reconfigured or rethought in the digital age, or do you think that free speech is actually fine as it is and not in contradiction with a more encompassing legal framework in terms of human rights?
I mean, I'm thinking aloud here, so this could go dreadfully wrong. But one thing that strikes me is there's all sorts of speech that is not allowed on Facebook, not allowed on Twitter, not allowed on most of the main social media platforms, that is protected speech in Europe, right? So the restrictions on speech on the social media platforms we've been talking about is much stronger than the legal restrictions on speech in Europe. And in fact, in the United Kingdom, there's a proposal for an online harms bill or some such thing that potentially makes social media companies legally liable for content that it itself is not actually illegal in those countries. And so I actually find it striking that we have that discussion around the difference in US and Europe speech, when in actual fact the restrictions on the social media platform is much greater than the legal restrictions in Europe.
Yeah. I would say two things come to mind when you bring up this issue. Is one, the basis of free speech in the U.S. is partly based on our belief in freedom of the press and the press's ability to counteract harmful speech or incorrect speech or disinformation, misinformation. And two, the U.S. is this extremely litigious society. I mean, you all know we're in the law school, but and so we do need to update the freedom of what is hate speech for the technology companies, because as you all know, they're being treated as platforms as opposed to media companies, but treating them directly as media companies is also not the solution. So what is the middle ground, and what type of corrections can be made to, I believe, it's the Communications Decency Act 230 that everyone is always referencing. And another point I was going to, returning to the importance of the press, is people always talk about it in disinformation panels and whatnot, but we need a strong press, and right now, because of social media and because of originating with Craigslist and other things, and the shift of advertising on social media, the press is underfunded, and there needs to be a new economic model so that they will be able to counteract disinformation and maintain the trust of the public with high-quality investigations. And so those are the two issues I think that are encompassing this issue of free speech in the U.S. and globally, is supporting press, which in turn supports democracy and good quality free speech. Yeah.
So, go ahead. So I actually I want to push back a little bit on what Katie said, particularly about that we need updates to CDA 230. We've already seen one case where Congress decided to update CDA 230, and the ramifications were disastrous for the very people they were trying to protect. This is the I forget which form of it passed, whether it was SESTA or FOSTA. It was to prevent sex trafficking posts online, and instead it has basically shut down the online discussion by victims of sex trafficking who are trying to recover or build communities and support networks. And so there's I really shudder anytime anyone suggests that we should be putting companies as the speech police. Because they will inevitably, because Andy doesn't want to get a huge fine, he is going to overcorrect And if he was doing anything else, his shareholders would riot because he should be doing the safe thing. It's a for-profit company. And so I really, really shudder anytime the motivations are just totally different for a company than for a government. And so putting some sort of governmental authority to censor speech or prevent certain speech in a company it's a terrible idea.
Sorry, really quickly. I was going to say, yes, I agree with that. And BOSS was not a good implementation. I guess that's why I was purposely vague, because the solution has not been found of how to regulate hate speech in the U.S., especially because of the threat of suing and the.
So I think the direction that we're going is that there's going to be the concept of illegal speech and like potentially harmful speech, and there's going to be sort of two distinct types of speech, and that with regard to illegal speech, companies are going to be obligated to have systems to like aggressively take it down. And for harmful speech, I think companies are going to be obligated to be really transparent about the prevalence of that kind of problematic content on their platforms, and then also have clear policies that state one way or the other what they're going to do about those kinds of things. And then they're going to be held accountable at the kind of like systems level rather than at the like anecdote individual piece of content level. I think that's the direction that we're going.
So I think we have time for one last question probably, and then we'll probably have to shut down.
Hi, Jessica Field from the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. I'm surprised that we got this deep into the panel without talking about David Kaye, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression's really excellent report from last year on AI and freedom of expression. We've talked a bunch about how companies might be implicated in solving the potential implications. We've talked a little bit about national governments, but I wanted to ask the panel about the role of intergovernmental organizations in this space. And also note, sorry, a little selfie, but we have David Kaye coming to Harvard later this month. If anyone is interested in participating in a workshop around AI advocacy, come and let me know.
Anyone on the panel want to react to that very excellent and really smart question, which the panel should definitely know about?
I read everything David Kaye writes, as to that. I have nothing to say on the role of intergovernmental organizations, unfortunately. So, but it's a plug for David Kaye. I appreciate it.
It might be a bit of a cop-out, but I think that it's not just intergovernmental organizations, but actually, an external body that involves academics and members of the companies, but doesn't have the same economic incentives as the companies to, provide oversight and, be a place where people can appeal, like you were mentioning.
I mean, I guess the only thing I would add is I think intergovernmental organizations, whether existing ones or new ones, are going to be important to this for sort of two reasons. One is the reason that Dunstan suggested, which is like these principles are international, and two is the sort of just reality that communication is cross-border. And so I do think intergovernmental solutions are going to be important to this in the long term.
And I think that perhaps as a final word, what this discussion also shows, and in line with the keynote, is that potential solutions to these emerging difficulties and problems are by nature interdisciplinary and across domains. And I think that already it is kind of remarkable that people can sit at the same table and kind of start developing a common language and a common set of references to think about these questions. And so we're at the law school, at major university, we have people from nonprofits, business, technology companies, academia. And I think that, no panel will cover all the questions relating to the difficulties that come up with AI. And the reason for that is usually that the ramifications of AI are multiple and take place across domains and in ways that are often hard to predict and hard to design. And so I think it's not a bad way to conclude this panel and thank our panelists for their insights and their participation. Thank you.